Kesubos Daf Dalet. It takes us to the end of the fourth parak of the Masechta. Towards the end of the daf will begin the fifth parak Afalpi. The end of the fourth discusses the two Tanai Ksuba that we're still discussing. One we're in the middle of is the Tanai Ksuba that support is given to the daughters. They don't inherit, but they do get supported from the estate. The Gemara will have two questions, situations in which there is not really Ksuba, but there may be support, there may be this Tanai Ksuba. Then the Gemara will get to the last Tanai Ksuba, and that is the support that's given to the Amana. If the husband dies before the wife, the Yisomim who inherit his estate have to support the wife. She also has rights to Ksuba. That's a Tanai Ksuba. When does she lose that? Until when does that support go? And some other questions on the topic. Then the Gemara will round up the discussion with a few stories and end the parak on that note. So let's begin. We have two more questions in which we're discussing the Tanai Ksuba, that support is given to the daughter. The first question is, what if her mother died as an arusa? That means to say she never did nisuin, she only did an eirsin with the girl's father. They had Eirsin, there was a child born from that Eirsin. Obviously, there was an Isser that was performed there, and the child was born, the child was a girl. The question is, does she get support? Now, in Arusa, is a machlokes whether or not she gets a ksuba. Even if she, al pidin, doesn't have a takanas ksuba, it's possible for him to promise a ksuba for her. But either way, the ksuba is something which is generally written by the nisuin. It's not something that happens yet. So the Gemara's question is here, on the possibility that there is a ksuba, but it's not written yet. So do you say that there is a Tanai ksuba for the daughter? On the one hand, there is a ksuba. On the other hand, the ksuba didn't really take effect yet. It wasn't really written. Ksuba is kind of suspended for later. So in that situation, is there a Tanai Ksuba that is a support to the daughter? So Gemara says that is a Teku. It's a question that stands. We don't have an answer. Second question is asked by Rav Papa. What about the daughter of an Anusa? Somebody who was raped. Now the halacha is if a man rapes a woman, or specifically a Nara, he has to marry her and he has to pay knas. Now, there's a machlokes tanoim if he has to give her a ksuba besides the knas. The knas payment may count as the ksuba. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says that she gets a ksuba of 100 besides the knas. The Rabbanon say that the knas is the ksuba. She doesn't get a ksuba beside for that. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this Anusa has a ksuba. As long as she has a ksuba, she should have the Tanai ksuba, which is the support that's given to her daughter. The question is, according to the Rabbanon, do we say that there is a Tanai ksuba when there isn't a ksuba? According to them, there is no ksuba. So the Gemara's possibility is the only reason there's no ksuba for her is because the function of the ksuba is to make the woman confident that her husband won't divorce her. Here, the Torah forbids him to divorce her. So there is no need for a ksuba. On the other hand, there is a need for a Tanai ksuba. So the question, therefore, is when you have no ksuba, but you do because there's no need for it, but there is a need for the Tanai ksuba, do we say you could have the Tanai ksuba without the ksuba, or do we say no, the Tanai ksuba is only part of the ksuba? If there's no ksuba, there's no Tanai. And again, the Gemara ends off with a teku. The question stands. We don't have an answer to that. Next, the Gemara moves on to the final Tanai ksuba, and as it's written in the ksuba that the almana herself, if her husband dies before her, will get the right to live in the house that belonged to her husband, and she gets supported financially from her husband until she kind of moves on from him. Once she moves on, the Gemara will define when that is. Once she moves on, she's no longer going to get supported. She does get her ksuba, though. The support that she gets is independent of her ksuba. The ksuba is money that she collects separately. And we saw the Mishnah that there is a machlokes between Yehuda and the other regions of Eretz Yisrael, whether she has a right to both of them, or the Yisomim can choose which one to give her. So the Gemara, first of all, points out that the language of the ksuba is that is that the husband writes for her in the ksuba, you will live in my house. After I die, you will live in my house. So the Gemara says this only applies if he has a roomy, spacious house that has enough room for the almana and the yisomim to live together without interfering with each other. If his property is too small, the yisomim take precedence, and they're the ones who get the land, they're the ones who get the house, they live in it, and they tell the woman, you have to go back to your father's house. You have a father's house to go to. We have no other house, and therefore you're going to have to go. And this Tanai Ksuba only exists when there's room for both of them, only when there's a house. And the reason is, had he meant to say it in any size, he would have said, you get to stay in my hut, even if I just have a little hut. But it didn't say that. He said only if you have a house, meaning a full-size house. Now, that's what Rav Yosef says. Gemara says in Marbar, Rav Ashi goes a step further, and he says that the entire Tanai Ksuba is batal if there's no house. If there's just a small house, it doesn't have enough room for her. And the Yisam don't even have to give her mizonos in that case. Gemara says the halacha is not like that. She does get mizonos in any case. Now the Gemara quotes Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, who starts the topic of when does she lose this right to support? When do we say she's no longer living in the memory and attached to her husband? She's moving on. She's no longer holding on to him. She's ready to move on, and she's looking for another husband and looking to move on with her life, and therefore she no longer gets supported. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman says in the name of Shmuel, that if somebody offers her to marry, so if she agrees, from the moment she agrees, there's no ksuba anymore. So the Gemara says that implies that if she says, I don't want to marry you because of who you are, then there will still be ksuba. The Gemara says, what do you mean? If the only reason she didn't want to marry the guy is because he was not suitable, that shows that she's no longer worried about the honor of her husband. She's no longer mentally connected to her husband, her first husband. And therefore, she's ready to get remarried. This just happens to be not the right guy, so she should lose the rights to mizonos already from then. So the Gemara says, yes, that is true. Rav Anan said that Mar Shmuel explained, this is referring to where the reason she gave is because I'm still attached to my husband. You're a very wonderful guy, but I'm sorry, I'm still attached to my husband. In that situation, she still gets mizonos. If it's not the reason, then she doesn't get mizonos anymore. Now, it says Rav Chizda, what happens if she's mizaneh? That's unfaithful. That surely seems to show that she's not connected to her husband's memory any longer. Rav Chizda says she does not get mizonos because of that. Now, Rav Yosef says if she starts putting on makeup, showing that she's re-entering the shidduch market, then she is also not connected to her husband anymore, and she loses her ksuba just for that. Now, the Gemara says Rav Chizda will certainly agree to that. Rav Chizda says when she was mezaneh, where she obviously had a very strong Yetzirah, and you could say that she's still connected to her husband, she just had a Yetzirah, but that already shows, says Rav Chizda, that she's not considered connected to her husband anymore, despite the fact that there's a Tahara. Then we would say that, meaning to say it's not really a deliberate decision to go be mezaneh. She was overcome by a urge. So in that situation, Rav Chizda says that she loses her ksuba anyway. Certainly, if she deliberately went out and entered the shidduch market, she would lose her ksuba. However, according to the opinion of Rav Yosef, who says that by entering the shidduch market, she loses her ksuba, not necessarily would he say the same thing by znos. It could be that since she do anything deliberately, it's not considered like she's not faithful to her first husband any longer. Says the Gemara, the halacha is not like any of these. All these symbols which were showing that she's not connected to her husband any longer, she loses her ksuba, are not true. She keeps her ksuba in all these cases. The halacha is like of Yehuda and of Shmuel, who says the only time she loses her ksuba is if she goes to Bezdin, she loses mizonos, that is. If she goes to Bezdin and she says, I want to be paid my ksuba up front. Even if she doesn't get it. From the moment she says, I want to be paid my ksuba now, that means she's saying, I don't want mizonos anymore, I'm not connected to my husband anymore, I want to take my money and go. From that time, she doesn't get mizonos any longer. The Gemara asks, we have a brisa that seems to indicate otherwise. The brisa says that she sells her ksuba, she sells the right to collect her ksuba to somebody else, or she uses her ksuba as collateral for a loan. In those situations, or a third thing is if she sets aside her ksuba as the source from which a chayiv that she has will be paid from. She makes it into what's called an apoitiki, that someone who she owes money to will collect from there. Either of these ways, she used her ksuba like money. She therefore is considering it to be collected. In all those cases, her mizonos ends because she's no longer connected to the husband. So this brisa seems to indicate that if she claims her ksuba, that's not a significant reason to end mizonos. Only if she actually uses it, sells it, gets rid of it somehow. So Gemara answer is no. These things, it doesn't matter where she performs this act, in a Beis Din or outside a Beis Din. If she gives over the ksuba to someone else, she sells it, or she uses it as collateral, or she sets it aside to be collected from, those things are showing that she's considering this ksuba collected, and she's no longer living in the memory of her old husband. However, if she claims the ksuba, that's only if she goes to Beis Din and makes a formal claim. She just makes a claim not in the Beis Din, that doesn't count, and that's why that brisa leaves it out. The Gemara now moves on to discuss the last phrase in the Mishnah, which is where we note that there's a machlokes between the people of Yehuda against the people of Yerushalayim and Galil as to whether the Yisomim have a right to say you're going to take your ksuba and give her the ksuba and then she has to support herself from the ksuba money. Do they have a right to have that out? So the Anshe Yehuda hold that they do, and it's written into the ksuba. Well, the Anshe Yerushalayim and the Galil say that as long as she wants, she can claim support and not ksuba. Now, the Gemara says this is actually machlokes haMaraim, what the halacha is like, what should be the standard text of ksuba. Rav says the halacha is like the Anshe Yehuda, the people of Yehuda, and therefore the Yisomim have a right to give her the ksuba and end the deal. Shmuel says no, as long as she wants support, she can take support. Now, the Gemara says, what was the established minig? So in Naharda and the region surrounding Naharda, they went like Shmuel, that is, she has the right. In the rest of Vavel, they went like Rav. So Gemara says it was an incident that happened where there was a woman who was married. She was from Mechuzah, and she was married to someone from Naharda. So she was in the place that held like Shmuel. She was in the place that held like Rav, that is, but she was married to someone who was from Naharda, where they hold like Shmuel. So she had an argument with the Yisomim, can they force her to take the ksub or not? So they came to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman heard by her voice that she was from Mechuzah, I guess by her accent. And he said, so the halacha is like Rav, so they could force you to take the ksuba. So she said, but my husband was from Naharda. And over there, the halacha is like Shmuel. So he said, if that's true, so then in that case, you do have a right to insist on mizonos following the halacha of Naharda, which is where your husband is from. Now the Gemara says, when we said the region around Naharda keeps this halacha, how far is called the region around Naharda? So the Gemara says, as long as they use the Nahardian measures. There are different measures used in different regions, as long as they use the Naharda ones, as the region that's close enough to Naharda to use the Nahardian numbers, that is the region that is going to keep the halachos of this Naharda. Okay, now the Gemara goes into a series of questions surrounding the Tanai Ksuba. So question number one, the Gemara asks, it's a series of cases which we will speak about. So the Gemara says, what about the clothing that the almana is wearing? Does that count as part of her own money, or does that count as support that her husband is giving to her? The husband bought the clothing and he gave it to her. She's paid for the clothing with the estate. So do we have a right to deduct that from what she gets and say that this is clothing that she got? And if she goes and she takes her ksuba, so then the money, the value of her clothing is deducted from how much she could walk off with, because that's part of the ksuba that's given to her. It's her husband's. So Gemara says, this is a question. Rav and Shmuel have machlokes about it. Rav says it counts as the husband's and therefore it comes out of the ksuba. Shmuel says it counts as hers and it doesn't come out of the ksuba. So the Gemara said that interestingly you have a similar case, and that's a worker called a lakit, that is sort of like an indentured servant who lives in the home of his boss and is fed by him in exchange for his work. So there, when he leaves, does he have to count his clothing that he got from the boss as part of the salary? Or can he count that separately? That's a gift that the boss gave him that he gets to keep. And it's not taken from his, whatever is owed to him. So the Gemara says in Machokis, what the opinions of Rav and Shmuel are there. According to Rav Chibar Avin, it's the opposite there. According to Rav Kahana, it's the same there. Same opinions you have here, you'll have there. And he says there's a simin, Yasma v'armalta shlach upuk. The orphans, meaning the lakit, the worker, and the widow, let them take off their clothing and leave. Not literally meaning that they should take off their clothing, but they should consider that the clothing belongs to their master and they need to pay for it. If they don't want to pay for it, then they'll have to take off their clothing and leave, which is just a way of saying that they need to pay for it. So says the Gemara, what's the halacha? So Rav Nachman says, we learned the Mishnah that seems to support Shmuel, but in truth the halacha is like Rav, because if you look in the Mishnah deeply, it really supports Rav. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says somebody who's makdish, or he's marich all his property, he's makdish himself, or he's makdish all his property, or he's marich himself for all the value, which includes greater than the value of everything he owns. So whatever belongs to his wife is not hektish. What belongs to his wife? So it says his wife's clothing, and any clothing that he made for her, or any shoes that he made for her, or for the children, all of that is not considered to be his property that he was makdish. So you see clearly that his wife's clothing is considered her property, not his property. So it shouldn't be deducted from the ksuba. Clear support to Shmuel. So Gemara says, no, the halacha is like Rav, and this brisa doesn't really support Rav. Here, this is true because he's still married to his wife, and there's no separation. So therefore, he's giving his wife her clothing, and it's hers to keep. The case where we have is where there's a separation. Either there was a divorce or she's a widow, and therefore the marriage is ending. There, he's not giving it to her to keep. There, he wants it back, or his estate wants it back, and she needs to give up on it or pay for it. Now the Gemara brings a couple of stories. So story number one is the daughter-in-law of the family of Eliashiv. The daughter-in-law of the family of Eliashiv, she was claiming ksuba from the orphans, and they went to court to evaluate how much she gets. On the way to court, the orphans said, the clothing you're wearing is old and worn out. It makes us look bad that you're wearing that. Could you wear something fancier? So she went and she put on all her fanciest clothing. When they came to the court, they said that the halacha is like Rav, and therefore any clothing she owns is deducted from the ksuba, and then they already saw all the fancy clothing that she owns because they tricked her into wearing it to court. Next says the Gemara, there was a guy who on his deathbed set aside a certain amount of valuables to give to the daughter for support, and then those values went down in value. So you would think that the daughter should be able to claim, I need more things, because he wanted to give me a certain monetary amount, and now they're worth less. So the Gemara says that's not the halacha. The halacha is that she takes the loss, because he wanted to give these specific things, and not a specific coinage amount. Now, a different case that happened is where somebody said that 400 zuz worth of wine goes to the daughters, and then the wine became more expensive. So now 400 zuz worth is less wine. So here again, the Yisomim win because he was only identifying a certain amount of value, and therefore that's what he gives, and she does not get that specific amount. She gets less wine. That is the dollar value that was set aside for her. The Gemara brings one final story to end off the Perek, and that is again relatives of Rav Yochanan. We've had a conversation between them and him previously. Now here it is again. The relatives of Rav Yochanan had a mother or a wife of their father who used to eat a lot, and the husband lay dying, and they were afraid that she, for her support, would end up totally using up the estate to the father. So they came to Rav Yochanan for advice. So Rav Yochanan said, to tell your father before he dies to set aside a certain piece of land, that this is where her mizana should come from, and that way she's limited to that value. Anything more than that she can't take, and therefore the rest of your inheritance will be protected. So they did it, and after he died, the father died, they came to Rish Lakish and said, our father set aside this land for her mizanos. So Rish Lakish said, differently than Rav Yochanan, Rish Lakish said, that means he was adding, besides for the general mizanos she gets, she also gets this extra. Rav says, that's not what they said to Rish Lakish, that's not what Rav Yochanan said. He said that she's limited to this. So Rish Lakish wasn't impressed. He said, go give her, bring it here, and give her what she deserves, or I'm going to take Rav Yochanan out of your ears. So they went to running to Rav Yochanan, and he said, what can I do? Rish Lakish is as great as I am. And if he argues with me, there's nothing I can do. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Avo said that in the name of Rav Yochanan, it depends on what exactly the language that the father used was. When he said that this extra piece of land is going to be for the ksuba, did he say limizonos? This is to the mizonos, meaning it's added on to the mizonos, and she gets this plus others. That's what Rish Lakish's ruling was. But if she said bimizonos, this is in place of the mizonos, this is from where the mizonos is from, then he said that it should only be from here and not from anywhere else. This concludes the fourth parak of the Masechta. Now we begin the fifth parak Afopi. In the Mishnah, in the beginning, parak Afopi discusses if you can have more or less in the monetary award of the ksuba. So first of all, the Gemara discusses more. The Gemara says the standard ksuba is 100 zuz for an almana and 200 zuz for a basula. If he wants to add more on his own, he can. The Gemara will explain why that's a chiddush. He can add as much as he wants, up to 100 moneh if he wants. Now, what happens then? So Gemara says machlokes, if she can collect it as if she becomes a widow or divorced from being in arusa. If she's in a nesua and then the marriage ends, she can collect the full amount, including whatever he added. If the divorce or the death of the husband happens while they're just in arusa, there the Tanakama says she can collect it, and Elazar ben Azariah says she cannot collect it because the only reason he gave her extra is to be married, and then therefore the extra is dependent on nisuin. The Mana Masayim that she will get. All right, now what happens if he wants to negotiate a lower ksuba amount? Can he do lower? So Rameir says no, and if they come up with any shtick to make it lower, it's a biaznus. The marriage is void. Ravida says no, he can't write a lesser amount of the ksuba against Hakanas Chazal, but she could write a document that he paid me and I received it. In that way, the husband requires less because he's holding a receipt that says he paid it already, and therefore a lesser payment is what he would legally be claimed against. The Gemara now begins, and all we'll do is the first step. The Gemara says, what's the chiddush that he can add? Of course he can add. The chiddush might be that Chazal limited it to this specific amount in order to not embarrass anybody who can do more, and therefore he wouldn't be allowed to do more. Kamash Milan, that you're allowed to do more. Chazal never had that intention.